President because he was so boisterous and verbose over Twitter, including what read to a lot of people like an accidental confirmation of obstruction of justice. Quote, "I had to fire General Flynn because he lied to the vice president and the FBI. He has pled guilty to those lies. It is a shame because his actions during the transition were lawful. There was nothing to hide." That's a problem for the president on a number of levels, but the very next day, the White House told the press that tweet was dictated by the president's lawyer, John Dowd. So it wasn't the president's words that the president was tweeting out after all. That Twitter post created so much controversy originally because it seemed to signify the first time the president has acknowledged publicly that he knew Flynn lied to the FBI before Mr. Trump fired him last February. That raised a new set of questions about whether the president's actions amount to obstruction of justice. Here's what the Washington Post reported about the White House reaction. Quote, "A person close to the White House involved in the case termed the Saturday tweet a screw-up of historic proportions that has caused enormous consternation in the White House." And here is what John Dowd told NBC News when asked about the president potentially obstructing justice. Quote, "The president cannot obstruct justice because he is the chief law enforcement officer under the Constitution, Article 2, and has every right to express his view of any case." And by the way, a number of experts disagree with that and say our system rests on the belief that no one is above the law. Also, we've learned that General Flynn was not acting alone. NBC News reports Jared Kushner and former National Security Deputy Advisor K.T. McFarland both spoke with Flynn about contacting the Russians. And the New York Times reports tonight that an email McFarland sent during the transition appears to have contradicted testimony she gave Congress about contacts between Flynn and then Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. And we have news about another Trump associate tonight, and that's Paul Manafort. Federal prosecutors say he violated a court order by ghostwriting an editorial about his political work in Ukraine. And tonight, the Washington Post is reporting prosecutors also say that one of Manafort's longtime associates, quote, has been assessed to have ties to Russian intelligence. The first time the special counsel has alleged a Trump official had such contacts. All of it this weekend led the president to double down on his attacks on Hillary Clinton and his attacks on the FBI. Quote, "After years of Comey with the phony and dishonest Clinton investigation and more running the FBI, its reputation is in tatters, worst in history, but fear not, we will bring it back to greatness." Well, that brought this response earlier this evening on this network from one of our own analysts, former FBI agent Clint Watts.
I'm more now worried about our president tearing down democratic institutions. He is an enemy of the state whenever he is pushing against the FBI in that way.
Let's bring in our leadoff panel on a Monday night. Kimberly Atkins here with us, chief Washington reporter for the Boston Herald. Jonathan Lemire is back with us, a White House reporter for the Associated Press. And Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at CIA and the Pentagon. All three are MSNBC political analysts. Mr. Bash, as best you can you lay out the Flynn matter for our viewers in this way? How much further damage do you think the president did this weekend?
Well, Friday's plea bargain by Mike Flynn really boxed the president in. And then when the president tweeted on Saturday this tweet, I think it really is the tweet which will live in infamy. Because what he did was he confirmed that he knew in January of 2017, when the FBI interviewed Mike Flynn, that Mike Flynn had lied. The warning came from the attorney general. It's shot straight up to the president. And the president, in firing Jim Comey, knew that a felony had been committed, and that not only was the FBI investigating Mike Flynn, but in fact they were investigating the president and his inner circle. And so Friday's Friday's paperwork that accompanied the Flynn conviction, his plea bargain, showed that Flynn was not acting alone, that he was acting in full concert with the president and his inner circle. The president appears to have obstructed justice, not in an investigation about Mike Flynn, but in an investigation about the president and his inner circle himself.
Kimberly, the president was on the road today, a speech out in Utah, and yet this day starts with Flynn, goes to McFarland, goes to Manafort, and for good measure, Roy Moore ends up getting thrown in the president's day.
Yes, I mean, and this is at a time when Congress is trying to work out the tax plan that the president wants so much. But this investigation just seems to envelop everything, and not just the investigation, the president's reaction to it. These are a series of more self-inflicted wounds that we've seen in the past when these news of the Flynn plea deal came out. Subsequently, we've seen the attacks on Hillary Clinton, the attacks on the FBI, the attacks on this entire process, because he's lashing out at it and not realizing that in the process of that is saying things like, well, I fired him because he lied to the FBI. And then there's the subsequent reporting that he was indeed told that Michael Flynn lied to the FBI weeks before he fired him, and before, this is the consequential part, before he asked James Comey, according to James Comey, to let this thing go with respect to the Michael Flynn investigation. All of these things are just little more drops in the bucket that fills up, that gets closer and closer to what could be an obstruction charge. And keep in mind, we don't even know everything that Robert Mueller and his investigators know.
More than that, we know a small portion of what Robert Mueller knows. And yet, to her point, Jonathan, it feels to lay people like tightening. So how are Trump's allies and associates taking all of this?
There's actually a great schism right now in Trump world. His legal team is still preaching confidence. Ty Cobb, John Dowd, they've suggested this was going to wrap up shortly. There was one prediction that it'd be over by Thanksgiving. That obviously has come and gone.
Where are they getting
Yeah, by most people, outside observers suggest no, this process has a long way to go. But for now, anyway, the president is willing to listen to them. He has been telling people close to him, he believes he's going to be exonerated. He believes that this will clear up. Now, there are many of his allies, both inside the White House and out, who think this is exactly the wrong approach, he fielded several calls this weekend, according to the reporting done in the Associated Press, from allies who say, Mr. President, I don't think that you understand necessarily the gravity of the situation you are in right now, the ramifications of this tweet. You need a new tactic, whether that means a new legal team or a new legal strategy, or even setting in motion the mechanism that could lead to the replacement of Robert Mueller. The president right now has said he doesn't want to go down that path. He has told some advisors he's not considering pardons at this moment. But this is going to come to a head sooner than later.
Jeremy Bash, let's talk about the FBI, one of the president's targets over the weekend. If you're old enough, you grew up in this country when the FBI was a bureau and a television show, and we would sit at home and marvel at the courage of these federal law enforcement officers. Now, they've had some FBI directors with a unique idea as to what the law is in this country, but by and large, these are federal law enforcement officers. We were raised to respect the FBI. This is not, however, the first institution the president has sought to diminish, tear down, and criticize.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the note that Chris Wray, the director of the FBI, sent to the entire FBI workforce earlier today. Basically, he said, keep your head down, keep calm, and tackle hard. That was his motto. And he basically said, don't listen to the noise in Washington. It was a pretty stunning rebuke to the president, who has been unleashing these massive criticisms on the men and women of the Bureau who protect our country. They enforce the laws, they investigate crimes, and they conduct important national security work, protecting us from the kinds of threats like Russians interfering in our elections. And I've talked to FBI agents, very senior folks, former folks, and they are horrified and offended at the way the president has been attacking the Bureau, which is a national treasure.
Kimberly, we're also being asked, after witnessing how personal and immediate the president's Twitter feed is, we're being asked to think that this one tweet was given to him, was dictated to him by his lawyer. Everything else is directly from him.
Right. And it was the only time, the first and the last time.
That's right.
You know, lawyers like me were focusing on the fact that the word pled guilty was used. And if you've gone to law school,
right,
you know the word is pleaded. And just it reads like Donald Trump's tweets, the way he tweets them. So I have yet to find someone who truly believes that John Dowd wrote that tweet. It was clearly trying to clean something up, perhaps in the process assert some sort of attorney-client privilege if there's questions about exactly how this tweet came to be, but clearly just the same kind of cleanup after the fact, after some sort of mistake is made, to try to allay the fears of the president and give them a talking point to try to explain this away. It's tough.
Jonathan, does the fear now go to Kushner? People who are looking forward, looking at the next pieces, do all eyes move to the son-in-law and senior advisor?
It's certainly possible. It's a short list of candidates. He has been identified by sources as the very senior official who Mike Flynn talked to during the transition, who's reached out to Russian officials at that transition official's behest, therefore essentially carrying the message of the president. There is a belief that, yes, that he could be next. We know that Don Jr. has also been in the crosshairs of Mueller and his probe. And that leads to the question of, how is the president going to react? It has become sort of a truism as this probe has gone on, that as there becomes a moment of increased pressure, the president reacts in sort of a less than particularly hinged manner. We see that on Twitter. We see that at a rally. We see that in his comments to reporters on the South Lawn. As it creeps closer and closer to his family, to his son, to his son-in-law, as it creeps closer and closer to his front door, which is what a lot of people think the tweet this weekend indicates. That's something that this is a real possibility that obstruction is in play here. How does the president react? And do we head down that path that some of these advisors, as indicated before, want him to try to start the process to push out Mueller, which would, not an overstatement, lead us to a full-blown constitutional crisis.
All right, Mr. Bash, you and Kimberly might be the lawyers here, but can you come up with a phrase like less than particularly hinged? That one's going in the Hall of Fame. Having said that, with your lawyer's eye, what are you watching for next and this coming week?
Well, my view, Brian, is that this is going to turn really to the issue of obstruction. I think Bob Mueller is going to really dig into the question of what were the conversations inside the West Wing about the firing of Jim Comey. The president has acknowledged publicly that he did it with the Russia investigation on his brain. If there can be some now corroborating evidence to this tweet that shows that the president knew a felony was committed and that Flynn had lied to the FBI, and with that knowledge, he fired Jim Comey, that I think ratchets up the pressure on the president big time.
Our great appreciation to our leadoff panel on a Monday night as we start a new week. Kimberly Atkins, Jonathan Lemire, Jeremy Bash. Thank you all for coming on tonight and coming up for us. The party of Trump now officially the party of Roy Moore. Today, the president delivered a full-throated endorsement of Moore. Now the GOP jumps back into the Alabama race. And next up, a legal breakdown on the claim of one of the president's lawyers that the president cannot obstruct justice because he's the president. That and more. We're just getting started on a Monday night.
They came out of nowhere, sir.
How many of them?
We don't know. Dozens.
All right, let's teach these freaks some manners.
Good luck out there, Captain.
We want to take a moment here to talk about whether the president can or cannot obstruct justice. His own lawyer, John Dowd, says he cannot because the president. And here is Harvard Law School professor Alan Dershowitz this morning in a segment that was praised by Donald Trump.
You cannot charge a president with obstruction of justice for exercising his constitutional power to fire Comey and his constitutional authority to tell the Justice Department who to investigate, who not to investigate. For obstruction of justice by the president, you need clearly illegal acts. With Nixon, hush money paid, telling people to lie, destroying evidence.
There has been much discussion throughout the day about this legal defense. A report in the Washington Post saying this, quote, the brazen assertion Monday by one of President Trump's lawyers that a president cannot be found guilty of obstruction of justice signaled a controversial defense strategy in the wide-ranging Russia probe as Trump's political advisors are increasingly concerned about the legal advice he is receiving. Here to talk about it, Jill Wine-Banks, former assistant Watergate special counsel and an MSNBC legal analyst. And Jack Sharman is with us, former special counsel for the House Banking Committee, now the Financial Services Committee during the Whitewater investigation. He is these days a criminal defense attorney. Jill, I'd like to begin with you. Is any American above the law? Is the president immune to charges of obstruction of justice?
I think anybody who studied history and studied the Watergate case knows that if it proved anything, it proves that no one is above the law and that the president can be charged with obstruction of justice. He was an unindicted co-conspirator, that is President Nixon, in the Watergate indictment. And today I actually looked at our indictment. And so many of the overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy to obstruct justice are things that I can hear Donald Trump's lawyer arguing, well, the president has power to do that. He has absolute authority, so he can't be charged with it. Well, the president and all his top aides were actually charged with that, and they went to jail. They were convicted. The president had to resign as a result of all of that. He was impeached in the articles of impeachment for both obstruction of justice and for abuse of power. So even if you don't think it's obstruction, you have to realize that it is at least an abuse of his power. He cannot pardon everyone. That would be an abuse of a power he clearly has, but he cannot abuse it. So I do not accept the argument of either Dershowitz or Dowd.
Jack, same question to you.
Well, clearly the president under Article 2 has extensive constitutional authority over the executive branch, and he can fire an FBI director. He can stop an investigation. He can even fire a special counsel. He has the authority to do that. What he may not do, though, is to do so corruptly. And if a president does so corruptly, that is to influence or impede an investigation under certain federal obstruction statutes, he or she can be charged with obstruction of justice. So if President Trump's lawyers are asserting just as a blanket proposition that he cannot be charged, that's not accurate.
Jill, another question for you, something we civilians grappled with this weekend about this tweet. Can a tweet really get the president in further legal jeopardy? And does it matter if Mr. Dowd says, yeah, that's on me, that's my bad, I dictated it, because it went out under the president's name and imprimatur?
I think what's important to understand is, what did the president know? I hate to go back to Watergate days, but okay, I won't say it. What did the president know and when did he know it? But the question is, did the president know at the time that he fired Flynn that Flynn had lied to the FBI? Did he know at the time that he told Comey to stop the investigation that Flynn had committed a felony? If he was trying to stop an investigation where he knew that a crime had been committed, that's clearly an improper act. And so the content of the tweet is what's important. And it doesn't matter whether John Dowd conveyed information he got from the president or whether the president wrote it himself. Either way, if the president knew about the crime and then tried to stop the investigation, that's an obstruction of justice, and it's something that is really a serious offense.
And Jack, a weighty question for you is impeachment, in your mind, as we talk about this tonight, a foreseeable possibility?
Well, presumably it's foreseeable depending upon what the special counsel's ultimate report is or is not. Impeachment, of course, is a somewhat different and peculiar constitutional animal because it's both legal and constitutional and political. An offense that might be impeachable need not necessarily be a crime, although it often is. We're probably a long way from any such consideration, and even it's probably wise to not overread things like tweets. But is impeachment something that would potentially be considered by some, especially if there are no criminal charges brought? Certainly, but I think it's probably premature to make those predictions now.
Two first-rate experienced lawyers have given us all of us civilians, a lot to talk and think about. Jill Wine-Banks, Jack Sharman, thank you both so much for being with us here tonight. Coming up as we approach another break, what it means for the Senate race in Alabama as the Republican Party as a whole, now that the president and the GOP are fully supporting Roy Moore. That and more when the 11th hour continues. RNC, which had pulled out of the race after Moore was accused of sexual misconduct, the RNC has now jumped back into the race in support of Moore. Moore, as we've reported, denies the claims against him. The news came tonight after Moore received a full-throated endorsement from Donald Trump today. To quote from the president's aforementioned Twitter account, Democrats' refusal to give even one vote for massive tax cuts is why we need Republican Roy Moore to win in Alabama. We need his vote on stopping crime, illegal immigration, border wall, military, pro-life, VA, judges, Second Amendment, and more. No to Jones, a Pelosi-Schumer puppet. The Washington Post also out with new details tonight on one of the women who says she knew Moore when she was a teenager. Robert Costa is going to join us on that in just a moment. But first, we figured we'd get a status report on the race tonight at the big board. Our national political correspondent, Steve Kornacki. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Brian. Yeah, and look, a week from tomorrow, Alabama voters are going to go to the polls. We will find out. But look, that's the story right now. Trump, complete endorsement now of Roy Moore. Signals of a changing posture from Mitch McConnell, the RNC. Why are we seeing these signals now a week out? Take you through what's been happening here. Look, 2 weeks ago, this is what the lay of the land looked like politically in Alabama in this race. You see, 2 weeks ago, if you averaged the polls together back then, Doug Jones, the Democrat, had the lead. The significance, obviously, that was the first time in more than 2 decades a Democrat was leading in polling in a U.S. Senate race in Alabama. And so Republicans were saying, you got all these stories coming out about Roy Moore. He has now fallen behind. Maybe the bottom is going to fall out. Maybe the floor is going to fall out here for Roy Moore, and he's just going to collapse. They weren't sure. They were keeping their distance. You didn't have Mitch McConnell sending the signals he's now sending. What has happened since then? Stabilization. This is not massive movement, but I think it's significant. Roy Moore back into a small but seemingly steady lead in the polling of this race. You see here about 2.5 points over Doug Jones. Now, again, that is close. That is volatile. We're in uncharted territory here in a lot of ways. We're not sure who isn't going to turn out for an election in the middle of December in Alabama. So this is not to say Doug Jones can't win this race next week. It is to say that Republicans who 2 weeks ago thought Roy Moore might actually just fade out in this thing, they're now looking at it and they're saying, yeah, he absolutely can win. Maybe he's the favorite to win. And we don't want to lose this seat. And so that's the most significant move, I think, today. In the last 24 hours, it's Mitch McConnell. 2 weeks ago, he was talking about expulsion. He was saying, hey, you know what? You win this election, Roy Moore, you're going to face an ethics investigation. You're going to be under oath. You might be expelled. Now, that's a very different posture from him. It suggests that if Roy Moore does win this race a week from tomorrow, that Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans will say, the people of Alabama have spoken. That settles the matter.
Steve Kornacki, as always, fantastic stuff from the big board. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. As promised, we go to Robert Costa, national political reporter for the Washington Post, moderator of Washington Week on PBS, also an MSNBC political analyst. He's in Tuscaloosa tonight covering this race. And Robert, what do you make of the percentage of voters who are on the move, the vote that is migrating perhaps back and forth between these candidates? Or do you think, as Steve seems to indicate, this is getting a little bit baked into the cake now?
It's a significant move, Brian. I spent the whole day here in Tuscaloosa and in Birmingham talking to voters. And when they're talking about a Senate race, as much as they're talking about the Crimson Tide football team, you know this is a hot race in the state of Alabama. What I've found, Brian, in the course of my reporting is that many voters are very skittish of Roy Moore. They're unhappy and wary of these allegations against him. At the same time, they're deeply conservative when it comes to their own political views. So the question for Doug Jones, the Democrat, is in this last week, this final chapter, can he actually bring them across that finish line because of the moral question, not because of politics?
Tell us about this story your newspaper has tonight. More evidence from one of the women accusers.
The Washington Post continues to talk to the women who have made these credible accusations against Roy Moore, and the Roy Moore campaign continues to say that these are not credible accusations, and one of the ways they have done so is questioning the yearbook of one of the accusers, the signature of Roy Moore inside of that yearbook. The Washington Post has new reporting tonight by Stephanie McCrummen, who broke the stories that shows notes signed by Roy Moore, alleged to be signed by Roy Moore. We believe they are signed by Roy Moore at the Washington Post that show that he was friendly to the least, likely in some kind of relationship, of courtship in the early 1980s when he was in his 30s, and this woman who makes the statement tonight was in high school.
And Robert, about the RNC, we mentioned they are back into the race. It was widely reported when they pulled up stakes and went home. Now, do you think as a result of the president's endorsement, it was kind of incumbent upon the party to go back in?
It was more than incumbent, Brian. The president owns the party. The party may like to think of itself as a somewhat independent operation, but it is not. When you have a president in your own party, inside of the White House, that means he or she owns the Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee. So they really had little choice here. You see some independence for the moment with the National Republican Senatorial Committee not going in all in when it comes to Roy Moore and in Alabama. But the RNC, it follows what President Trump wants.
Well put, as always. Robert Costa with us tonight from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Thank you so much. And coming up for us this evening, just what was in that tax bill the Senate was racing to pass when last we spoke here on Friday night, and what needs to happen before any of it gets the president's signature and becomes law. That and more with two experts when we continue.
Now, one huge step closer to delivering to the American people the historic tax relief as a giant present for Christmas. Remember, I said we're bringing Christmas back. Christmas is back bigger and better than ever before. We're bringing Christmas back.
Christmas is coming back. When we last spoke, and by the time we got off the air Friday night, there was no vote yet on the tax bill in the U.S. Senate, though it was clear that's where they were headed, and they were going to go all night if need be. Then just before 2 a.m. came the party line vote, and a lot of folks spent the weekend trying to figure out just what was in the bill. About 500 pages thick, some of it handwritten. We have here tonight two journalists who have done that and can talk us through what now has to happen with the House version. Starting with our own Ali Velshi, co-host of Velshi and Rule at 11 a.m. Eastern on this network. He is also the host of MSNBC Live at 3 p.m. Eastern on this network and chose to come back in and join us on the night shift. And there is Jeremy Peters, the dome behind him, political reporter for the New York Times and an MSNBC contributor. Gentlemen, truly welcome to you both, and thank you for coming. Ali, what's in it?
Yeah.
What's not in it?
All right. The important things are that this was sold as middle-class tax relief that was not going to be particularly advantageous to the wealthy and that was going to cause a remarkable economic growth. On all 3 points, it's simply not true. The vast majority of middle-class earners, at least earners earning up to $75,000, we'll see over the length of this, over 10 years is how we stretch it out, we'll see an increase to their taxes. This will be a great benefit to the wealthy through the elimination of the AMT and the estate tax. The House and the Senate treat them both a little bit differently, but they're both things for high earners. And a number of studies, including from Goldman Sachs, from Wharton, have looked at the growth potential of the economy as a result of this tax bill. Goldman just said this morning that what it'll do is it'll goose economic growth a little bit for a couple of years, and then it might actually have a negative effect on economic growth. And there's no report that indicates less than a half a trillion dollar addition to the national deficit. Some go as far as adding $2 trillion. So it is, whether you like it or not, and whether you like the effect it's going to have on you or not, it is intellectually disingenuous. It has been sold as one thing, and it is entirely something else.
And Jeremy, that brings us to a follow-up question. Some of the more insidious, some of the sneakier items that people like you have found in this based on days of reading what passed Friday night.
There are a lot of giveaways to the right, especially the religious right, Brian. For example, there's a provision in there that would allow savings plans that were previously used only for colleges to be used for private and religious secondary schools. So you could deduct your Catholic school, high school tuition. Or sorry, you could set aside money to save for that in these tax advantageous plans. You could also do the same for homeschooling costs. So that's another big giveaway to the religious right. In kind of a gut punch to the left, to Chuck Schumer especially of New York, you used to be able to set aside money in an account that would allow you to save on your bike commute to work. You will no longer be able to do that under the Senate provision of the plan, and of course in New York, those city bike shares, or people who bike to work every day. Washington has the same type of program. You're not going to be able to set aside money to do that anymore. Another provision that kind of went unnoticed is also a giveaway to distilleries. And guess where there is a lot of distilling going on? In Kentucky, the home state of Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader.
I was just figuring out where McConnell is from. So, Ali, what stands between Senate bill, House bill, President signing something before, say, the end of the year?
Two things, probably not much. I think there's going to be a deal, but there are two things that are standing between them. One is there are apparently some deficit hawks still around. A few Republicans who are actually concerned about the damage this will do. The president's argument and the argument of those around him is that this will grow the economy to such a degree that the addition to the deficit will just disappear. Again, that doesn't actually bear out. The other thing standing in the way of it is Republican members of Congress from California, from New York, New Jersey, and other places where there are high state and local taxes, because they are one of the two plans is going to eliminate the deduction for state and local taxes that a lot of people who are not necessarily high earners but middle income earners use, their property taxes or their state taxes. A number of Republicans again voted against the House bill and have said they will not support a bill that still has those deductions. Now, the bottom line is there's very little political capital involved in taking away those state and local deductions when you're a senator, because there are no senators from the places that are affected by this. So those are the two things that are going to stand in the way: taking away state and local deductions and not satisfying some members that this is actually going to not be harmful to the deficit. Senator Corker was not convinced of this, which is why he didn't support the bill.
They lost him. Now, Jeremy, we've heard the president say, in addition, Christmas was apparently missing, and it's been found and is coming back, that he is calling this a huge Christmas present to the American people. The question is, are lawmakers actually going to go home and run on this? Is there going to be pride in authorship? Is this going to really make the customers happy enough to run on?
I don't see that, Brian, and I spent a good chunk of last week talking to Republican lawmakers, a lot of whom said to me, we are having a really hard time selling this back at home. Our voters don't believe this will benefit them. They believe it benefits corporations and the wealthy, but not their bottom line. So unless the bill turns out to be something dramatically different than the analyses have told us it will, Republicans will have a difficult time running in 2018 and 2020 saying that they gave a big tax cut to working Americans.
Two really smart guys to walk us through this really complicated 500-page thick thing that was passed Friday night. Ali Velshi, Jeremy Peters. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Coming up, a national monument designated by President Barack Obama, downsized by President Donald Trump, angering some Native American groups and some environmentalists along
land in the world. In protecting it, we live up to our obligation to preserve our natural heritage.
The chunk of Utah the president is setting aside is extremely valuable. As potential coal mines go, it's a gold mine. What will now be called the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument is worth almost $1 trillion for the coal that's beneath the extraordinary landscape. Protecting it will infuriate many in Utah, and it already has.
In all of my 20 years in the United States Senate, I've never seen a more clear example of the arrogance of federal power. Indeed, this is the mother of all land grabs.
That report from a young and so far unidentified White House correspondent traveling with President Clinton 21 years ago, the day he dedicated Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in Utah. It angered Utah Republicans that day, and they have done a slow burn about it ever since. And today, they got their wish when the president shrunk the amount of land set aside for Escalante by about a half, and one other, Bears Ears National Monument, by 85%.
Some people think that the natural resources of Utah should be controlled by a small handful of very distant bureaucrats located in Washington. And guess what? They're wrong. I've come to Utah to take a very historic action to reverse federal overreach and restore the rights of this land to your citizens.
To put this story another way, there are 2 million fewer acres in our national monuments tonight compared to when we woke up this morning. And that's the largest such rollback in U.S. history. Today on this network, the vice president of Navajo Nation reacted to the news.
Today marks 1 week after President Trump, mentioned the Pocahontas deal. Mm-hmm. And now we're looking at another troubling action by the White House. And it just, it's a sad day. It's a sad day in Indian country. It's a sad day for Americans.
Well, with us tonight to talk about what happened today, Pulitzer Prize-winning presidential historian and author Jon Meacham. John, outside Utah, and especially on the coasts, no one woke up today saying, you know what, we have an annoyingly large amount of pristine land. We should talk to somebody about reversing that. So what happened, in your view, today?
No, it was not top of mind, I think, for a lot of folks. And I think TR, the sound you hear in the background is Theodore Roosevelt spinning around in his grave. As you pointed out, that unnamed White House correspondent back in '96 put his finger on it, which is an enormous amount of coal. It's been a source of great agitation in Utah for a biblical 21 years, the definition of a generation. And what happened here is President Trump, interestingly, using some of the classic language of Ronald Reagan, who in 1964, in the great speech that he gave for Barry Goldwater that introduced Reagan to the country as a political figure, he said that a key tenet of modern conservatism was that we could run our lives better than bureaucrats in a distant Washington. Whether that was a conscious echo today or not, I don't know. But it was part of that anti-government tradition. The interesting thing about this is, historically speaking, no president has ever really done extremely well by failing to protect natural resources. This is just over a century of a movement. Again, Theodore Roosevelt, who was close to John Muir, the great naturalist, began the national parks, began the national monuments in an attempt to conserve in the classic sense. And it's one more step of this Republican Party being something that is a force for the corporate interests as opposed to those of the more classic conservative interests.
John, serious question. Where do you think this would poll if we did opinion polling? And I assume it will be polled. And the second part of it is, have any other presidents given land back, given land that was preserved to special interests or mineral rights or anything like that?
The second President Roosevelt did. He shrunk the Grand Canyon for various reasons. I think if you poll this, it doesn't seem to me to be a big winner to put more land at the service of the coal industry. President Trump likes to talk about beautiful coal, but it feels like an elective decision on his part. It is once again an attempt by this president to serve his base of support, his base interests, not reaching beyond that core base. And I was thinking about TR, who was sort of our Winston Churchill, a great writer, a great politician, he talked about how the wilderness had charm, melancholy, and mystery. And one of the things that I think we have here is a kind of melancholy hour where you have a president who is going to serve those corporate interests as opposed to the conservation ones.
I saw that quote earlier tonight on something TR could not have anticipated, and that is the Twitter feed of our guest tonight, John Meacham, presidential historian and author. Thank you, sir, very much for being with us after this day.
Thanks,
coming up here as we continue, as John can tell you, if you watch a lot of cable news, you already know this. Senators say the darndest things. Tonight's installment after the break. We're back, and the last thing before we go tonight, senators say the darndest things. Here are two things recently said by U.S. senators, both loosely having to do with the effort to pass the tax bill. We're just going to let them say their thing, and we're going to leave it at that. The first, Louisiana Republican Senator John Kennedy, no relation, talking about politics on Capitol Hill.
I've been in politics a long time. This is perfectly normal. Part of politics is drama. And everybody up here has politics in his blood, kind of like herpes. We will get through this.
Louisiana Republican Senator John Kennedy, did I mention no relation? Next up is Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley. Comments he now claims were taken out of context. Comments